Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the dense psychological nightmare of Franz Kafka's absolute classic, The Metamorphosis. We're going to map this whole thing out into a clear, structured visual journey. Together, we'll unpack the terrifying truths Kafka reveals about human nature, societal pressure, and what actually happens when literally everything you know about yourself is suddenly stripped away.
Here is our roadmap for today's existential journey. We'll be starting with 1, the Metamorphosis awakening, followed by 2, when fear becomes anger, 3, the trap of societal roles, 4, stages of utter despair, and finally, 5, the weapon of shame.
All right, let's get into Section 1, the Metamorphosis Awakening, a cheerful cast for a cheerful book. So let's meet our main players here. First up, we've got Gregor, our protagonist. He's a hard-working traveling salesman who inexplicably wakes up one morning as a giant dung beetle. Then there's his sister, Greta. Now, she starts off as a fundamentally kind person, but as we'll see, the sheer stress of this bizarre situation warps her personality into something much, much crueler. We also have the father, whose immediate reaction is just intense fear and a violent desire to keep Gregor completely hidden from the outside world. And finally, the mother. Her maternal instincts are totally shattered by the sight of her son, leaving her mostly weeping in the corners of their home. You see, this isn't just a quirky story about a bug. It is a profound study of how ordinary people react to the downright impossible.
Moving right along to Section 2, when fear becomes anger, the danger of fear.
Since they are entirely unable to escape their situation, the family turns their initial panic into this destructive whirlwind. And, it ties perfectly into Sigmund Freud's classic fight or flight concept. Think about it. When flight isn't an option, because you're literally trapped in a house with a perceived monster in the very next room, that paralyzing fear has to rapidly transform into aggressive anger just to survive. Kafka brilliantly uses the family's reaction to show us how unmanaged fear completely poisons the mind and destroys any ounce of compassion.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the stark contrast between practical panic and profound existential terror. On the surface, sure, the family is terrified because Gregor was the sole breadwinner. Without him working, they have to face the incredibly frightening prospect of finding their own jobs. But the deep fear, the real terror lurking underneath, that's what Gregor now represents. He is a walking, crawling reminder that life can fall apart at any moment, with absolutely zero warning, and there's no way to just go back to how things were. When they look at this beetle, they see the extreme fragility of their own comfortable reality. And that deep existential dread is what truly fuels their hatred. They aren't just mad at Gregor, they're furious at the universe for changing the rules on them.
Which brings us to Section 3, the trap of societal roles, identity, and pride.
To truly grasp what Gregor is going through, think about this grounded, real-life example. Imagine a highly dedicated dancer who tragically breaks both legs in a freak accident. Because his entire identity, his pride, and his sense of self were hung on his ability to perform on stage, losing that ability plunges him into a deep depression. He only manages to escape that misery by forging a completely new identity, say becoming a physicist, which gives him a brand new pillar to build his self-worth upon. Well, this perfectly mirrors Gregor's sudden inability to be the sole provider. When literally everything you define yourself by is taken away, your job, your ability to provide, even your own human body, it causes catastrophic psychological harm.
Let's map out exactly how different existential philosophers would view Gregor's crushing loss. Schopenhauer takes a pretty pessimistic view. We assign ourselves goals, and failing to meet them, just as Gregor has, plunges us straight into despair. Camus, on the other hand, is more optimistic. He suggests we find meaning in the struggle itself, kind of like Sisyphus endlessly rolling that boulder. Sartre would argue that real fulfillment comes from living an authentic life and flat-out refusing roles that just don't fit. And Nietzsche? He'd tell us to forge entirely new values and stand apart from the roles humanity tries to impose on us. Kafka is taking these massive, lofty philosophical concepts and bringing them right down to earth through Gregor, who finds himself suddenly stripped of his role and is completely lost as a result.
Let's move into Section 4, Stages of Utter Despair, Gregor's Decline. Let's track this absolutely heartbreaking progression, which is driven entirely by his family's continued hostility and abandonment. Step 1 is mourning. Early on, Gregor still loves his family. He literally hides under the sofa when his sister enters the room because he knows his appearance scares her. He's anxious, but he clearly still cares. But as they continue to isolate him, we hit Step 2, rebellion. He becomes spiteful. He starts climbing the walls to frighten his mother and sister, essentially screaming at them, "I am here, acknowledge me."
He just desperately wants to be noticed and respected. When that fails, we reach step 3, surrender. His spirit completely breaks. He stops eating, stops moving, and simply waits to die.
This actually perfectly explains Gregor's rebellious wall-climbing phase, showing us what happens when someone tries absolutely everything to be noticed and respected, but fails. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote about this exact state of mind. When a person feels totally abandoned and rejected, with zero hope of ever being cherished again, they enter this second stage of despair. They become consumed by misery and lash out at the world in furious indignation. So, Gregor isn't just climbing walls to be annoying, he is desperately trying to reassert his existence to a family that has functionally erased him. 1. That number represents the single apple violently thrown by Gregor's enraged father. It lodges right in Gregor's back, becomes terribly infected, and ultimately kills him. This is the tragic climax of our story. When Gregor finally escapes his room in this ultimate plea for connection, he isn't met with understanding, he is met with outright violent hatred. The father's fear has completely solidified into lethal violence. One single apple, thrown by his own dad, breaks Gregor's spirit for good, pushing him from rebellion directly into surrender, and, eventually, death.
And that brings us to Section 5, the weapon of shame, an amoral tool. Okay, be honest with me for a second. Think back to a completely thoughtless moment. Maybe you accidentally made a "your mom" joke to an acquaintance, totally forgetting that their mother had recently passed away. Recall that agonizing, burnt-in feeling of shame, the way your cheeks flush and you feel the harsh eyes of the world just judging you. It's an incredibly powerful, almost universal human experience. And in Kafka's world, it is the invisible cage that traps every single character. Kafka masterfully drowns every single character in their own unique societal shame. Gregor is drowning because he can no longer work, and his body is physically repulsive. The father feels a deep, emasculating shame at having to take a low-level servant job at a bank, which honestly only fuels his intense anger toward his son. The mother is deeply ashamed that she is terrified of her own flesh and blood, and the family as a whole takes on bored, arrogant lodgers just to make ends meet, suffering the intense shame of being talked down to in their very own living room. Literally, everyone is utterly crushed by their failure to meet the expectations of society.
It really makes you realize the dark side of societal interaction, where shame is used to ruthlessly enforce cultural values onto the individual. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously argued that we willingly accept societal roles to live in a peaceful, orderly world. We give up a little freedom for security. But critics like Nietzsche look at it very differently. They argue these obligations aren't willingly accepted at all, they are forced upon us. And the mechanism used to force us into line? It's shame. Shame acts as the internalized gaze of society. It dictates how we should look, how we should provide, and exactly how we should act. The family in the Metamorphosis destroys Gregor not just out of fear, but because his very existence brings immense societal shame upon them.
We're going to wrap up our explainer today with Kafka's ultimate, lingering warning. Kafka uses this whole bizarre, tragic story to show us that shame itself is an amoral tool. Sure, it can be used to maintain order, but it can also be used to ostracize, to abuse, and even to celebrate the death of a family member. So, considering the horrible deeds people will do just to be free of feeling shame, how might the shame you accidentally or even intentionally impose on others be secretly destroying them?